Oi, fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn. Oh yeah.
Welcome back, everybody, to I Hate Roy Cohn, and so should you. How Roy Cohn ruined the world. Today's episode isn't really about politics, gang. It's about something much older. This is about how human beings decide what's true. Because every generation believes it has invented propaganda. Now, every generation believes that misinformation is new. Well, I hate to say it, but it isn't. Technology changes, but the psychology doesn't. And we've talked about Roy Cohn over and over and over. In fact, I believe that this is the namesake of this podcast, but there's a reason. It's not because history repeats itself exactly, it doesn't, but communication strategies often outlive the people who created them. The historians describe Roy Cohn as someone who approached public conflict through relentless counterattack, maintaining the initiative and refusing to let the discussion remain on unfavorable ground. And whether every historian, describes him exactly the same way, that's not the point. The point is that his career gives us useful historical case study. Let me say that again. Useful historical case study. Not because we should see Roy Cohn everywhere, because history gives us plenty of frameworks, and frameworks help us ask better questions. Now, one of those questions is remarkably simple, gang. How do we know when a public claim deserves our confidence? Not because we like the speaker, not because we dislike the speaker, because we have evidence. And that, that sounds obvious until we remember how human memory actually works. Psychologists have studied something called illusory truth, as we discussed in the last one. And the principle's deceptively simple. The more often that we hear a statement, the more familiar it becomes. And that familiarity has a tendency to feel like truth. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say repetition makes something true, because it doesn't. What I said was repetition can influence how convincing somebody about something feels. Now, that's an important distinction. Evidence and familiarity are not the same thing, and our brains evolved to recognize patterns quickly. Now, usually that's helpful, and sometimes it isn't, because familiarity becomes a shortcut. We stop asking, how do I know this? And begin thinking, I've heard this before. Those are not the same sentence. This is why civilization keeps records and transcripts and court filings and interviews, reports, papers, because documents remember more accurately than people do. And this brings us to an important habit. Always begin with the source, not the headline, not the commentary, the source. Read the methodology and the transcript, watch the interview and the court filing, and ask what the document actually says before asking someone else what it means. Let's consider the Heritage Foundation, the liberal think tank that was responsible for 2025 project types. Now, obviously, dripping with sarcasm was me calling the Heritage Foundation a liberal think tank, but you would think when these facts are presented to Bone Spurs supporters that, Bernie Sanders was the head of the Heritage Foundation. But no, that's not the case, gang. See, he founded in 1973. It's become one of the most influential conservative think tanks in the United States, and its mission is openly conservative. That isn't hidden. It's part of its identity, truly. And understanding a source means understanding its perspective. But perspective doesn't automatically invalidate evidence, nor does it automatically validate it. Now, good scholarship asks different question. How was the information gathered? What does the organization claim its data measures? What are the stated limitations? And the Heritage Foundation's election fraud map is a useful example. Before looking at any conclusions, read Heritage's own description. Now, the organization states that the database is sampling of proven instances of election fraud. Those words matter. Sampling proven instances. It's not presented as a census of every election crime, nor as a measurement of undetected fraud. Understanding methodology is part of understanding evidence. Now, what does that allow us to conclude? The database documents real, proven cases. Election fraud has occurred, and people have been prosecuted. Now, different types of election offenses exist. Those conclusions follow directly from the documented record. What the database does not do is answer every question someone might have about election integrity, and recognizing the limits of evidence is just as important as recognizing its strengths, gang. Now let's consider another documented example. One of my favorites that I love to bring up because I like to see if it gets swatted away, and that's the villages in Florida. Several residents were prosecuted after investigators concluded they'd voted in more than one state. Reporting noted that several of those individuals are registered Republicans. Why am I mentioning that? Not to construct a new stereotype, quite the opposite. Because evidence has an annoying habit of refusing to fit neatly inside the stories that we tell ourselves. Reality is usually more complicated than the slogans, and that leads to another habit worth developing. Separate your observations from inference. Here's your observation. A documented case exists. Here's your inference. What that case means about a broader population. Those are different steps. Now, good reasoning doesn't skip from one to the other. The same principle applies to interviews. When watching a public conversation, ask yourself two questions. What question was asked? What answer was given? Sometimes they match perfectly and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the response expands the discussion and sometimes it reframes it entirely. None of those possibilities automatically tell you whether the speaker's right or wrong. They simply tell you to pay attention. Roy Cohn tells you, never admit defeat, attack, attack, attack. Now, media literacy isn't skepticism towards everything, it's disciplined curiosity. It's really learning to say, I'd like to see the source, I'd like to read the methodology, I'd like to compare today's statement with yesterday's. Those are remarkably powerful habits. Now, Roy Cohn's historical importance isn't merely the man himself. It's the reminder that the public communication has always involved strategy. And psychology reminds us that repetition influences familiarity. History reminds us that communication tactics evolve more slowly than technology, and neither discipline tells us which conclusions to reach, gang. They simply give us better tools for reaching them, and the internet's given us something extraordinary, and that's access. Like we can read original court opinions and legislation, speeches and interviews, like previous generations couldn't do that shit. Use that privilege. Go to the record whenever possible. Now, here's the framework I try to follow, gang. What is the claim? What is the evidence? What does the source actually say? What are the limitations? What conclusions are directly supported and what conclusions require assumptions? Those 6 questions will take you farther than any slogan ever will. What's the claim? What's the evidence? What does the source actually say? What are the limitations? What conclusions are directly supported? And what conclusions require assumptions? The truth doesn't become stronger because it's repeated. It becomes stronger because it survives examination. And that's why receipts matter. Not because they tell us what to believe, because they tell us and allow us actually to test what we already believe. Reality happened exactly one time. Our memories will always be imperfect. Fortunately, the public record remembers. Now, notice what happens in this exchange, gang. Did you see the interview where JD Vance was on Bill Maher's show? I'm not really a big Bill Maher fan, but he did, for once, bring it. Now, like, Bill Maher's questions, like, his concern was like claims of ballot fraud and accepting election outcomes. And JD Vance's response moves to a different subject, the role of technology companies and information distribution during the campaign. Now, whether you find the response persuasive is up to you, but it illustrates an important media literacy question. Did the answer address the original question, or did it redefine the question? See, that's not a partisan exercise. That is a critical thinking exercise. I also like the fact that Bill Maher said to JD Vance, you conservatives need to stop this. Either we won or it was rigged bullshit. It needs to stop. Because it's a cynical move that's poisoning democracy. And honestly, before, we even talk about election fraud, we need to talk about evidence. Because every major political argument eventually reaches the same question. Not who do you believe, but what can you actually demonstrate? Now that's a very different standard, and it's the difference between advocacy and investigation. We've talked about Roy Cohn ad nauseum, and historians described him as someone who favored that relentless public combat. Keep the initiative and counterattack. Don't let the conversation stay where it began, whether or not you think those descriptions fit every historical situation isn't today's focus. Today's focus is something much broader, and it's how do we evaluate claims and how do we avoid mistaking repetition for proof. Once more, we have the Heritage Foundation's election fraud map, and before looking at any numbers, understand the source. They've been openly conservative since 1973. For decades, it's influenced Republican policy proposals and conservative political thought. Not only was there the original mandate for leadership that was given to Reagan, which turned into Reaganomics, and in case you don't remember, everything went to shit to the point where pop culture was even reflecting it. Watch Gremlins with the eyes of knowing what the economy was at the time, and then get back to me. See, the thing is it doesn't present itself as politically neutral. It presents itself as a conservative think tank, and that's important to know because understanding a source includes understanding its perspective, but understanding perspective doesn't end the conversation, it begins it. You know what I mean? Like, what Heritage says about its own database is that it describes the election fraud map as sampling of proven instances of election fraud. Proven instances, that's evidence, that's receipts, that's court filings. Not every case, but not an estimate of all fraud, not a measurement of undetected fraud, a documented collection of cases that have been prosecuted or otherwise established. Now that's an important methodological limitation, gang. Like, good research begins by understanding what a data set measures and what it doesn't. And what does that database establish? Well, it established the election fraud has occurred. People have been prosecuted and cases exist, but documents different categories of election crimes committed over many years. And those right there, those are important facts. See, what it doesn't establish by itself is the total amount of election fraud in the United States. Heritage says that as much. But recognizing that limitation isn't a criticism of the database, it's simply reading the methodology. Researchers who have examined Heritage's collection also pointed out another observation compared with the enormous number of ballots cast over decades of American elections. The documented cases represent a very small proportion of all votes. That doesn't prove fraud never occurs. It clearly does. Look at the guy who traveled from Arizona to California to vote just to prove that election fraud is real, and then he ended up getting busted. Absolute mental juggernaut that gentleman was. Seemed like the database demonstrates that the question becomes one of scale. When someone makes a broad claim about prevalence of election fraud, is the available documented evidence support that claim? Is it there? I mean, that's an empirical question, not a partisan one. Like I said, several residents of the villages in Florida were prosecuted after authorities concluded they'd voted in more than one state during 2020. But reporting identified several of those individuals as registered Republicans and supporters of Donald J. Trump. Why mention that? Because not that it proves that Republicans commit more election crimes. The evidence doesn't establish that. It illustrates something far more fundamental, and it's that evidence often refuses to sit neatly inside of our assumptions. The documented record can complicate narratives on every side, and that's why primary sources matter. Notice the method. We didn't begin with the conclusion. We began with the record. Seeing what does the organization say about its own database? What do the documented cases show? What do they not show? Those questions matter, gang, because they separate evidence from inference. This isn't just about elections. It's about every public controversy you'll ever encounter. Read the studies and the court filings, transcripts, the methodology, and compare it with the claims being made, and ask yourself, is it directly supported by the evidence? And what requires additional assumption? Where does the documentation end and interpretation begin? And those questions are the foundations of critical fucking thinking. The internet gives us unprecedented access to original documents. Use them. Don't rely on summaries. Don't rely solely on headlines. Go to the source whenever you can, not because the source is infallible, because every interpretation should begin with the record. Truth doesn't become stronger because it's repeated. It becomes stronger because it survives scrutiny, and the record exists so our memories don't have to carry the entire burden. Receipts don't ask you to trust them, they invite you to verify them, and that's a habit worth cultivating, not just in politics, but in journalism, in science, in history, and everyday life. Because reality happened exactly one time. Our job isn't to memorize narratives, it's to compare them with evidence. Remember, after the end of a 10-minute filibuster, you can simply say, "I'm very happy for you. Now present your evidence." And fuck Roy Cohn.
Oi, fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn. Oh yeah.